Now, Whistler, in a way, loves this, because he then shows it in London a few months later in a commercial gallery in Berners Street with a label next to it saying, "Rejected by the Academy." A year later, he takes it to Paris, to the illustrious salon there. It gets rejected again. And in fact, it's then shown in what's called the Salon de Refusé, where all the artworks that had been rejected by the Salon were gathered together, including perhaps the most celebrated controversial work of the 19th century, Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe. And oddly enough, this work causes almost a similar kind of stir as the Manet. And Whistler becomes associated with what's called the avant-garde, or vanguard advanced artists. And Whistler suddenly has pushed himself to the forefront of the art scene in Paris and in London. Apart from the influence of photography, which was slow to develop through the middle of the 19th century, the single most important impact on Western art was Japanese painting. And this came about because in 1854, Japan and America signed a treaty, and it meant that Japan started to export, in particular, art and artifacts. And so that struck a chord and became a fashion amongst artists and men and women of society throughout Western Europe. And that's reflected and perhaps inspires this painting by Whistler called The Balcony, painted in the late 1860s when Whistler was wrestling with his own style, and in a way this is a transitional painting. In the foreground you can see four women having a Japanese party or tea party on a balcony, and stylistically the Japanese interest in flattening form, also cropping. This is an asymmetrical painting which is cropped, seems to be savagely cropped on the right hand side, and then you get these azalea flowers seeming to float across the surface of the canvas, and butterflies up here in the top left hand corner, and here in the bottom left hand corner Whistler, instead of signing his paintings, starting to use the butterfly as his own emblem, his own mark. But this is a painting of contrasts, and it's a hybrid painting, because in fact look at the faces of the women. They're not Japanese, they're Western women dressing up, theatrically playing the part, if you like. And then in the background you see factories and a river that in fact is the River Thames, and this is Whistler's own balcony in Chelsea in the West End of London. And he fuses these two realities together, and there's a contrast of the almost monochrome of the river and the factories with the bright colour of the Japanese tea party in the foreground. And this contrast between the prosaic and the exotic, and between painting as an illusion and painting as a decorative arrangement for mainly aesthetic reasons of colour and form, becomes the main tension in Whistler's art for the rest of his career.
The 37-year-old Whistler shared his Chelsea home, now number 96 Cheyne Walk, with his mother, who wrote to friends of how her son enjoyed his early morning rows on the river before joining her for breakfast. Then he'd go to his studio and lock himself away to work. But the boundaries became blurred for a time at the end of the summer of 1871, when he decided to get his mother to sit for him. Actually, she stood first of all, but after 3 days, Whistler realised it was too tiring for a 67-year-old woman, and so she sat gazing off into space at right angles to her son and presenting a noble, resigned profile for his contemplation. The work has become one of the most famous portraits ever made, odd in a way for such a mute picture dominated by black and grey. But that's part of its appeal, its solemnity, which opens it up to parody and humour. It's also a touchingly intimate portrayal of a man's mother, with whom he had a difficult relationship, but whom he clearly loved and respected. Anna Matilda McNeill Whistler was a devout Episcopalian Protestant who went to church each and every Sunday. Her resigned but defiant expression reflects a life of material comfort but maternal grief. She'd lost 2 children and a husband, and Whistler manages to convey the patience, fortitude and quiet dignity of a woman who has never quite got over her loss and never will. Whistler painted her portrait on the back of an old canvas, a gesture of economy that his mother may well have approved of, and which gave the painting a smooth, saturated, matte surface, which made her head all the more subtly pronounced, as if it were almost alive and about to turn towards us. Although the initial sittings with his mother were finished after a couple of months, the painting took Whistler years to complete, a labour of filial love which has struck a universal chord.
Soon after completing the portrait of his mother, Whistler began the most original and the most radical series of his entire life, called the Nocturnes, of which this, subtitled Blue and Gold, Old Battersea Bridge, is the most celebrated and perhaps the most extreme. When you look at it, it is clear that you're looking at a cropped version of Battersea Bridge, but rather than being a literal description, what Whistler is doing is giving us something that is evocative, that is atmospheric, hence the title Nocturne. Obviously this is painted at night, but the Nocturnes actually stem from Chopin's music, and he's trying to create a musical analogy. What Whistler is doing is moving towards the idea of abstraction and moving art away from literal depiction, because photography is already starting to do that. And he's putting forward an idea that's new in British art, that's developed in France, called art for art's sake. And Whistler says that art should be liberated from all claptrap and that it should only appeal to the artistic sense of eye or ear without, as he puts it, introducing emotions that are foreign to it. The scale and ambition of Whistler's work increased dramatically with a project that he began in 1876 known as the Peacock Room, which is one of the great achievements of decorative arts in the 19th century. It was for this room, the dining room, of a shipping magnate called Frederick Leyland, who had a house in London, and Leyland had an interior architect, a man called Jekyll, who was designing a room to show off his amazing porcelain collection. And Whistler was only invited in to advise about the colours to paint the doors and the shutters. There was a painting by Whistler that Leyland had bought here, which was at the centre of this wall, called The Princess in the Land of Porcelain. And Whistler argued that this painting actually looked much better in a room that wasn't decorated by red leather panelling, which is how the room was originally designed. So he had an agreement with Leyland that he just put some yellow on the walls in order to bring the thing to life. Leyland went away, having agreed this, and then Whistler took over. And this is the result. Imagine, you've agreed one thing, when you come back, this is how the room looks. And Whistler takes over, paints all the leather walls blue. He then adds gold to paint these extraordinary peacocks full of plumage on all the shutters and the walls, and eventually creates a total art environment. He titles this as a work, Harmony in Blue and Gold, the Peacock Room. Now, when Leyland returns, actually, he's not over the moon, because Whistler gives him a bill for 2,000 guineas, and they have an argument, and in the end they settle at £1,000. And Whistler gets his revenge by painting on the final wall this mural of two fighting peacocks, one covered in money and with money on the ground, and the other with a little plume which is reminiscent of Whistler's own whitening curls. And he calls this Art and Money, the Story of the Room. And the upshot is positive. Leyland keeps it as a dining room and uses it, and later it's acquired by an American railroad magnate called Charles Freer, and it ends up here in the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington. And for Whistler, it's one of his crowning achievements, a giant lacquered box that he, when he goes to Venice and sees the mosaics at St. Mark's, thinks just shades them, customary Whistler arrogance. And that dispute and the achievements of the Peacock Room put Whistler onto a different level of reputation, but also